Once upon a very, very long time ago, so long ago that even the oldest turtle would say, "Wow, that's ancient," there was a land nestled between two rivers. Not just any rivers, mind you. These were the Tigris and the Euphrates, two watery serpents that slithered across the earth, whispering secrets to the soil and tickling the toes of early civilizations. This land was called Mesopotamia, which, if you're feeling fancy, means between rivers in Greek. But the people who lived there didn't call it that. They were too busy inventing writing, farming, and the occasional dramatic myth to worry about Greek translations. Mesopotamia was flat, very flat, so flat that if you dropped a date on the ground, it might roll for miles before stopping. But it was also fertile, the kind of place where barley grew like gossip and sheep wandered like philosophers. It was hot, dusty, and full of potential, like a clay tablet waiting for a story. And stories, dear sleeper, were what Mesopotamia had in abundance. The people here, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, didn't just build cities. They built myths, big ones, loud ones, ones with gods who threw tantrums, fell in love, created humans from mud, and occasionally turned into dragons. You know, the usual divine drama. But before the gods came, there was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums with chaos. The kind that makes you wonder, is something about to happen? And oh yes, something was. The rivers whispered, the winds stirred, the clay trembled, and from the watery womb of nothingness, the first stories began to bubble up, slow, sleepy, and full of cosmic confusion. So, tuck yourself in, dear dreamer. We're about to drift into the myths of Mesopotamia, where gods are born from chaos, humans are molded like pottery, and love can start wars. It's a long journey, but don't worry. We'll take it one sleepy chapter at a time. And hey, if you're still awake, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Even the gods love engagement. Now, if you thought Mesopotamia was just a quiet stretch of land between two rivers, think again. But not too hard. We're trying to get sleepy here. As the rivers flowed and the barley swayed, something remarkable happened. People started building cities. Not just huts or tents or temporary mud arrangements, but real cities with walls, temples, and the occasional goat traffic jam. The first of these cities had names that sounded like someone sneezed into a clay tablet. Eridu, Uruk, Akkad, Nippur. Each one was a little kingdom of its own, with ziggurats that poked the sky, and priests who probably had very impressive beards. But here's the twist. These cities weren't just built by humans. Oh no. According to the myths, the gods were the original city planners. They didn't just hand out blueprints. They lived in the cities, ruled from the temples, and occasionally turned someone into a frog for bad manners. Let's start with Eridu, the oldest of them all. It was said to be the first city ever created, and it was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and I know better than you. Enki liked things tidy. He brought order to chaos, irrigation to deserts, and probably invented the first to-do list. Then there was Uruk, the city of Inanna, also known as Ishtar, but we'll get to her later. She's dramatic. Uruk was a bustling place, full of scribes, merchants, and myths. It was here that writing was born, which means it's also where the first complaint letter was probably written. Dear Enlil, the barley shipment is late again, and Akkad, Oh, Akkad, a city of ambition, where kings dreamed of empires and gods whispered in their ears. It was the seat of Sargon the Great, who may or may not have had divine help, depending on which myth you ask and how much wine the storyteller has had. But before the cities, before the bricks and the barley, there were the gods. And the gods, like any good celestial family, were complicated. They didn't just appear one day with name tags and job titles. No, they emerged from the primordial soup of chaos, like bubbles in a pot of mythological stew. First came the sky and the earth, then the waters, then the gods who ruled them, and then the arguments began. Because if there's one thing Mesopotamian gods loved more than creating things, it was arguing about who created them first. So, as the cities rose from the mud, the gods took their places in the heavens and on earth. They watched over the people, sometimes helped them, sometimes smote them, and always made sure their temples were well stocked with offerings. Pro tip: the gods really liked beer, and thus, the dawn of the gods mirrored the dawn of the cities, full of ambition, mystery, and the occasional divine tantrum. Before cities, before gods, before even the idea of a goat, there was chaos, not the loud kind with shouting and spilled lentils. No, this was the quiet kind, a deep, watery silence that stretched forever. It was called the Apsu and the Tiamat, the sweet and salty waters that mingled like two sleepy rivers spooning in the dark. Apsu was the fresh water, calm, wise, and probably the kind of guy who alphabetizes his clay tablets. Tiamat was the salt water, mysterious, powerful, and occasionally prone to turning into a dragon. Together, they floated in the void, doing absolutely nothing. For centuries, millennia, eons, until one day they got bored. And when primordial beings get bored, things happen. From their mingling came the first gods, little divine bubbles that popped up like hiccups in the cosmic stew. These early gods were strange, sleepy things. They didn't have temples or worshippers yet. They mostly floated around, blinking at each other and wondering what to do next. Eventually, one of them, probably nudged by a celestial coffee, decided to create something. And so, the sky was born. His name was Anu, and he was tall, regal, and very into being the boss. He stretched himself across the heavens like a sleepy blanket and declared, "I am the sky." Everyone nodded. It was a good sky. Then came the earth, Ki, who was solid, dependable, and probably smelled like fresh clay. She lay beneath Anu, and together they formed the first divine couple. They didn't talk much, but their chemistry was undeniable. From their union came more gods, more drama, and eventually, the idea of land. But the waters of chaos weren't done yet. Tiamat, the salty sea, watched all this creation with a mix of pride and irritation. She had birthed these gods, after all. But now they were noisy, ambitious, and building things without asking. She grumbled. She stirred. She considered turning into a dragon again, just to make a point. Meanwhile, the gods continued their sleepy expansion. They named things. They shaped things. They argued about who invented mud. And slowly, the world began to take form. Sky above, earth below, waters swirling around like a divine soup. It was a strange time, a beautiful time, a time when the universe was still stretching its limbs and yawning into existence. And somewhere in that cosmic yawn, the seeds of myth were planted. Now that the sky had stretched itself out like a cosmic bedsheet, and the earth had settled in, like a clay pillow. It was time for the gods to get organized. And by organized, I mean mildly chaotic, with a hint of sibling rivalry. At the top of the divine pecking order was Anu, the sky god. He was tall, distant, and very into being in charge. Think of him as the CEO of the cosmos, rarely seen, always respected, and probably allergic to meetings. Anu didn't meddle much in earthly affairs. He preferred the quiet of the heavens, sipping celestial tea and occasionally raising an eyebrow when things got dramatic. Next came Enlil, Anu's son, who was, let's say, enthusiastic. Enlil was the god of wind, storms, and I'm in charge now, thanks. He was powerful, moody, and had a habit of making decisions that affected everyone, like flooding the world or banishing humans for being too noisy. Basically, he was the divine equivalent of a grumpy landlord. Enlil ruled from Nippur, a sacred city where the wind never quite settled and the priests always looked slightly nervous. He was the kind of god who didn't just walk into a room. He gusted in, knocked over a few scrolls, and declared, "This temple needs more incense." And then there was Enki. Enki, the god of water, wisdom, mischief, and I have a clever solution. Enki lived in Eridu, the oldest city, surrounded by canals, fish, and probably a few enchanted frogs. He was the thinker of the trio, the one who didn't just solve problems, but made them interesting first. Enki was the kind of god who'd invent writing just to send sarcastic notes to Enlil. He loved humans, loved cleverness, and had a soft spot for chaos, as long as it came with a punchline. If Anu was the sky and Enlil was the storm, Enki was the river that giggled as it carved the land. Together, these three formed the backbone of Mesopotamian mythology. They weren't always friendly, they didn't always agree, but they shaped the world with their divine quirks and cosmic decisions. Anu gave the heavens structure, Enlil gave the earth rules, Enki gave the humans a fighting chance, and maybe a few tricks up their sleeves. And so, the divine family settled into their roles. The sky watched, the wind roared, the water whispered, and the myths began to flow like sleepy poetry across the clay tablets of time. Now that the sky had stretched itself like a sleepy god's hammock, and the earth had settled in like a warm loaf of mythological bread, the gods looked around and said, something's missing. They had rivers, they had temples, they had divine drama, but they didn't have anyone to appreciate it. No one to offer barley cakes, no one to sing sleepy hymns, no one to ask, "Why is the moon shaped like a banana tonight?" So, the gods decided to make humans, but not just any humans. These would be special, made from the very earth itself, clay to be precise, the same stuff used for pots, tablets, and the occasional emergency ziggurat repair. The story goes that Enki, the god of wisdom and water, and occasional mischief, took a lump of clay and stared at it thoughtfully. "This," he said, "will be a person." Then he poked it. Nothing happened. So he added water. Still nothing. Then he whispered a secret spell. Probably something like, "Wake up, sleepy mud." And the clay twitched. And thus, the first human was born. Squishy, confused, and probably wondering why everything smelled like riverbanks. But Enki didn't stop there. He shaped more humans, tall ones, short ones, ones with eyebrows. He gave them breath, movement, and just enough curiosity to be annoying. The other gods watched, impressed and mildly concerned. Ninhursag, the goddess of birth and mountains, stepped in to help. She added a touch of warmth, a sprinkle of soul, and maybe a dash of stubbornness. Together, she and Enki molded humanity, like sleepy sculptors on a divine pottery wheel. The humans were grateful. They built temples, they sang songs, they invented farming, which mostly involved yelling at goats and hoping barley would grow. They wrote things down, mostly complaints, but also poems and shopping lists. But the gods didn't just make humans for fun. They had a plan. You see, divine chores were piling up. Someone had to dig canals, harvest crops, and keep the temples tidy. The gods were tired. They wanted naps, so they gave humans jobs. Lots of jobs. And in return, humans gave offerings, food, prayers, and the occasional dramatic statue. It was a deal, a cosmic contract, a sleepy handshake between clay and divinity. And so, the earth was shaped, the humans were born, and the world began to hum with life. Not perfect life, not quiet life, but life with stories, laughter, and the occasional goat stampede. If Mesopotamia had a favorite child, a city that made the gods smile and the rivers hum, it was Eridu. Nestled near the edge of the southern marshes, Eridu wasn't flashy. It didn't have towering ziggurats that poked the stars or armies that marched in perfect rows. What it had was Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and I've got a clever idea. Just wait. Enki didn't live in a palace. He lived in the Abzu, a watery domain beneath the earth, filled with sweet water, fish that told jokes, and probably a few enchanted frogs who knew ancient secrets. From this sacred spring, Enki sent rivers flowing across the land like sleepy fingers tracing the belly of the earth. Eridu was his city, his sanctuary, his clay-covered laboratory of divine invention. Here, Enki taught humans how to dig canals, irrigate fields, and politely ask fish to move out of the way. He gave them knowledge, not all at once, of course. That would be overwhelming. Instead, he whispered it slowly, like bedtime stories told by a river. Here, he said, handing over the first plow. Try not to poke yourself. Here, he said, offering the secrets of writing. Use it wisely, or at least legibly. Here, he said, revealing the recipe for beer. You're welcome. The people of Eridu adored him. They built temples with cool, shaded courtyards and altars that smelled of incense and barley cakes. They sang songs in his honor, slow, sleepy hymns that drifted across the marshes like dragonflies on vacation. But Enki wasn't just wise. He was mischievous. He liked bending rules, especially when those rules were made by his brother Enlil, who was very serious about divine order. If Enlil said, "No humans allowed in the sacred garden," Enki would say, "What if they just peeked?" If Enlil declared, "Flood them all," Enki would whisper, "Maybe just a drizzle?" In one famous tale, when the gods decided humans were too noisy and planned to wipe them out with a flood, Enki snuck around the rules. He whispered the warning to a wise man named Atrahasis, who promptly built a boat, gathered animals, and survived the watery tantrum. Enki didn't break the rules. He just bent them into a clever shape. That was Enki's way. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He flowed. Like the rivers he controlled, Enki moved through the world with quiet persistence, carving paths of wisdom through the clay of chaos. And Eridu, his city, reflected that spirit. It was calm, clever, and just a little bit magical. A place where humans learned, gods chuckled, and the waters whispered secrets to anyone willing to listen. Once the humans were molded from clay and given breath, and possibly a few complaints, the gods looked down and said, well, they're alive. Now what? Because life, as it turns out, is messy. People wandered, goats wandered more, barley grew sideways, and no one could agree on how many sheep counted as a fair trade for a bronze spoon. So the gods decided to help, not with lightning bolts or dramatic speeches, but with something far more powerful: civilization. It started with writing. One day, Enki, who else, handed a reed stylus to a sleepy scribe and said, try pressing this into clay. The scribe blinked, pressed, and stared. What is it? He asked. It's a word, Enki replied, or maybe a number, or a recipe. Depends on your mood. And thus, cuneiform was born, the world's first writing system. It looked like tiny bird tracks doing interpretive dance across a clay tablet. But it worked. People could now record laws, trade deals, love poems, and complaints about goat theft. Next came farming. The gods taught humans how to dig canals, plant seeds, and yell at clouds. They explained the difference between wheat and barley. One makes bread, the other makes beer. Both are sacred. They introduced the plow, the sickle, and the concept of harvest festivals, which mostly involved dancing and hoping the gods weren't watching too closely. Then came temples. The gods didn't just want offerings, they wanted style. So humans built ziggurats, towering step pyramids that reached toward the heavens like sleepy staircases. Inside, priests lit incense, sang hymns, and occasionally tripped over ceremonial goats. The temples became centers of learning, law, and divine gossip. And speaking of law, the gods gave humans rules. Not just, don't steal your neighbor's ox, but deeper laws about justice, fairness, and how many dates you owe someone if you accidentally flood their field. These laws were carved into stone, whispered by priests, and occasionally ignored by kings. One famous set of laws came from Hammurabi, a Babylonian king who claimed the gods themselves had handed him the code. It covered everything from trade to marriage to what happens if your roof falls on someone. Spoiler, it's your fault. The laws were strict, poetic, and very, very detailed. But beneath all the rules and rituals, the gods had one goal: order. They wanted humans to thrive, not just survive, to build cities, write stories, grow food, and occasionally throw a festival with excellent music. Civilization wasn't just a gift, it was a test, a sleepy challenge wrapped in clay and wisdom. And so the humans learned. They scribbled, they farmed, they prayed, they argued about barley prices, and the gods watched, amused and occasionally impressed. If Mesopotamian mythology were a soap opera, and let's be honest, it kind of was, Ishtar would be the star. She'd have dramatic entrances, passionate speeches, and at least 3 wardrobe changes per myth, known as Inanna in Sumerian tales, and Ishtar in Akkadian ones. She was the goddess of love, war, fertility, and power, which is a lot of hats to wear, especially when you're also busy turning mortals into puddles of emotion. Ishtar didn't tiptoe into stories. She burst in. She was beautiful, fierce, and unpredictable. One moment, she'd be blessing lovers with passion and poetry. The next, she'd be leading armies into battle with a spear in one hand and a smirk in the other. She was the divine embodiment of I contain multitudes, and those multitudes were often arguing. Her sacred city was Uruk, where her temple shimmered with incense, music, and the occasional romantic scandal. Priests and priestesses danced in her honor, sang hymns, and probably whispered, "She's in a mood today," whenever thunder rolled. Ishtar had lovers, many lovers, mortal kings, divine beings, and possibly a few confused shepherds. But her romances were intense. Take Dumuzi, the shepherd god. They fell in love, they danced, they cuddled, and then she sent him to the underworld. You know, classic breakup stuff. She also had a thing for Gilgamesh, the mighty king. She offered him love, power, and immortality. He said no. She got mad. She sent the bull of heaven to stomp his city. Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu defeated the bull, and Ishtar was not amused. She probably unfollowed them on divine social media. But Ishtar wasn't just drama. She was depth. She represented the full spectrum of human emotion: love and rage, creation and destruction, tenderness and fury. She was the goddess of contradictions, and that made her powerful. You couldn't predict her. You couldn't control her. You could only worship her and hope she liked your offering. One of her most famous stories is her descent into the underworld, a myth so moody it deserves its own candle line. Ishtar decided to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. She passed through 7 gates, shedding a piece of clothing at each one. Symbolism alert. By the time she reached the underworld, she was vulnerable, exposed, and very, very mortal. Ereshkigal wasn't thrilled. She imprisoned Ishtar. The world above began to wither. No love, no crops, no joy. Eventually, the gods panicked and sent help. Ishtar was revived, returned, and the world bloomed again. But she never forgot that journey. It changed her, deepened her, made her even more mysterious. Now, if you've ever lived in a house with too many relatives and not enough snacks, you'll understand what happened next in the heavens. The older gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, and their celestial crew, had been running the show for ages. They created the world, shaped humans, handed out laws, and occasionally flooded things for fun. But the younger gods, they were restless. They'd been watching from the sidelines, holding divine clipboards, and muttering things like, "Why does Enlil get all the thunder? And Enki's fish keep stealing my sandals?" It started with whispers, then grumbles, then a full-blown rebellion. The younger gods wanted change. They wanted power. They wanted better temple lighting and fewer sacrifices that smelled like burnt onions. And most of all, they wanted respect. The kind that came with golden thrones and dramatic entrance music. One of the boldest among them was Marduk, a rising star from Babylon. He was strong, smart, and had a voice that could part clouds. The older gods saw him and said, promising. The younger gods saw him and said, "Lead us." Marduk didn't rush. He was clever. He waited. He watched. And then, when the heavens were just messy enough, he stepped forward and said, "I'll fix this, but I want full control. Also, a really big temple." The gods blinked. "You want what now?" "A temple," Marduk repeated, "with fountains and snacks." The rebellion wasn't violent. Not yet. It was more like a divine boardroom drama, with thunderous debates and lightning-powered PowerPoint slides. The younger gods demanded reform. The older gods resisted. And somewhere in the middle, humans kept farming, blissfully unaware that their creators were having a celestial meltdown. Eventually, The tension reached a boiling point. The heavens trembled. The rivers paused. Even the sacred goats looked nervous. And then came Tiamat. Remember her? The salty sea goddess from the beginning of time? She'd been quietly watching all this unfold, sipping primordial tea and muttering, "I knew this would happen." When the younger gods rebelled, she saw her chance. She gathered her own army, monsters, dragons, and divine chaos, and declared war. Suddenly, the rebellion wasn't just a family squabble. It was a cosmic showdown. The younger gods turned to Marduk. "You said you'd fix this." Marduk nodded. "I'll fight Tiamat. I'll win. But after that, I'm in charge. Deal?" The gods agreed, mostly because they were terrified, and also because Marduk had excellent hair. And so, the rebellion of the younger gods became the prelude to one of the greatest battles in Mesopotamian mythology. A sleepy, stormy clash between order and chaos, ambition and tradition, salty sea dragons, and very determined upstarts. Once upon a very ancient yawn, the heavens were tense. The younger gods had rebelled. The older gods were grumbling. And somewhere deep in the salty belly of the cosmos, Tiamat stirred. She was the primordial sea goddess, ancient, powerful, and not in the mood for nonsense. She'd birthed the first gods from her watery depths. Watch them squabble. And now, after centuries of celestial drama, she'd had enough. The younger gods were noisy. The older gods were bossy. And no one had sent her a thank you offering in millennia. So she did what any self-respecting chaos dragon would do. She declared war. But not just any war, a cosmic war. Tiamat gathered her forces. Monsters with too many eyes, serpents with wings, and creatures that looked like someone spilled divine ink on a nightmare. She crowned Kingu, her new consort, and handed him the Tablet of Destinies, a magical artifact that gave him authority over fate, weather, and possibly snack distribution. The gods panicked. They held emergency meetings. They lit extra incense. They tried to reason with Tiamat, but she was already halfway through assembling her chaos army and practicing her dramatic entrance. Enter Marduk, young, bold, and very good at speeches. Marduk stepped forward. "I'll fight her," he said, adjusting his divine belt. "But if I win, I get to be in charge. Also, I'd like a temple with a view." The gods agreed, mostly because they were terrified, also because Marduk had excellent posture, armed with a net, a bow, and a bag of winds. Yes, really. Marduk set out to face Tiamat. The battle was epic. The sky darkened. The rivers paused. Even the goats in Uruk stopped chewing. Tiamat roared. Marduk roared back. He threw his net, trapping her. He unleashed the winds, puffing her up like a divine balloon. Then, with a mighty arrow, he pierced her heart. The chaos dragon fell. Silence returned. The gods exhaled. And Marduk stood victorious, probably brushing off his tunic and saying, "Well, that escalated." But Marduk didn't just defeat Tiamat. He used her. He split her body in two. One half became the sky, the other the earth. Her eyes became rivers. Her tail became mountains. Her salty breath became the sea. It was divine recycling at its finest. From destruction came creation. From chaos came order. From dragon guts came geography. And so, the world was reshaped. The gods cheered. Marduk was crowned king, and the Tablet of Destinies was returned to its rightful place, probably in a celestial filing cabinet. The battle was over. Tiamat, the ancient sea goddess, lay defeated. Her monstrous army had scattered like startled pigeons. The heavens were quiet again. Not peaceful exactly, but the kind of quiet that follows a very dramatic thunderstorm and a lot of divine yelling. Marduk, the victorious young god, stood in the silence, holding the winds in one hand and the future in the other. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to build. So he looked at Tiamat's vast, defeated body, a swirling mass of salt, chaos, and ancient power, and said, "Let's make something beautiful." And he did. He split her in two, not out of cruelty, but out of cosmic creativity. One half became the sky, stretched high above, dotted with stars and sleepy clouds. The other half became the earth, solid and warm, ready to cradle humans, goats, and the occasional ziggurat. Her eyes became the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing gently across the land like watery lullabies. Her tail curled into mountains, her breath became the wind, and her roar echoed forever in distant thunder. It was divine recycling, mythological upcycling, a sleepy transformation from chaos to cosmos. But Marduk didn't stop there. He organized the heavens. He assigned jobs to the gods. You, watch the moon. You, manage dreams. You, keep an eye on barley prices. He created calendars, constellations, and possibly the first divine to-do list. He built Babylon, his sacred city, with walls that whispered wisdom and temples that shimmered with incense. He placed the tablet of destinies in his pocket, or maybe a very secure celestial drawer, and declared, "Order shall reign." The other gods watched, impressed and slightly jealous. Marduk had done what no one else could, turned destruction into design, chaos into comfort, myth into map. And the humans? They flourished. They farmed. They sang. They wrote epic poems about gods and floods and very dramatic dreams. They built cities, traded goods, and occasionally argued about whose goat was prettier, all under the sky, made from a dragon's body. After Marduk's victory and the rearrangement of Tiamat's salty remains into a functioning world map, the gods were feeling organized. They had cities. They had temples. They had humans who occasionally remembered to offer barley cakes. But there was still one thing missing: a plan. So the gods did what any celestial beings would do when faced with existential questions. They held a meeting. This wasn't your average scroll and snack gathering. This was the divine council, a heavenly assembly of gods, each with their own domain, their own opinions, and their own dramatic flair. Picture a celestial round table, but with more lightning and fewer coffee breaks. At the center of it all was the tablet of destinies. This wasn't just a fancy slab of stone. It was the cosmic control panel, a glowing, enchanted tablet that contained the fate of everything: weather, war, love, taxes, goat behavior, all written in divine script that only the gods could read, and even they sometimes squinted. Whoever held the tablet held authority. Marduk had it now, tucked safely in his Babylonian briefcase. But the other gods wanted input. They debated. They gestured. They made dramatic speeches about humans and their tendency to invent new ways to spill things. Some gods wanted strict rules. Humans must follow the stars, said one, and avoid loud music after sunset. Others wanted freedom. Let them dream, said another. Let them build love, and occasionally invent questionable fashion trends. Enlil, ever the stormy administrator, pushed for order. They must obey the laws, or at least pretend to. Enki, lounging in a puddle of wisdom, chuckled. Let them be clever. Let them surprise us. Ishtar, sipping divine wine, added, let them fall in love, and start wars, and write poetry about both. The council hummed with divine debate. Thunder rolled, stars blinked, even the moon paused to listen. And then, slowly, a consensus emerged. Humans would be given destiny, not as a rigid script, but as a winding path. They'd have choices, challenges, and the occasional divine nudge. The gods would guide, but not control. Watch, but not micromanage. Intervene only when absolutely necessary, or when someone forgot the proper incense. The tablet of destinies glowed softly, as if nodding in agreement. And so, the fate of humanity was sealed, not in chains, but in stories. Each person a tale, each life a myth, each moment a ripple in the cosmic pond. Once upon a very soggy time, the gods were tired. Not tired from creating the world, not tired from shaping humans out of clay. No, they were tired of noise. Humans, it turns out, were chatty. They sang, they argued, they invented drums, and they held festivals that lasted 3 days and involved questionable dancing. The gods, trying to nap in the heavens, were not amused. Enlil, the stormy god of order, had had enough. They're too loud, he grumbled. I can't hear myself thunder. The other gods nodded. Maybe we should ask them to quiet down. Enlil frowned. Or we could flood them, and thus began the divine plan to hit the cosmic reset button. But not everyone agreed. Enki, the god of wisdom and watery loopholes, wasn't thrilled. He liked humans. They were clever. They made offerings. They occasionally wrote poems about fish. So while Enlil prepared the flood, Enki prepared a secret. He whispered to a man named Atrahasis, wise, kind, and probably very good at building things. The gods are planning a flood, Enki said. You'll need a boat, a big one. Also, snacks. Atrahasis blinked. A flood? Yes. Enki nodded. A divine tantrum. But if you build the boat, gather your family, and bring animals, 2 of each, preferably ones that don't bite, you'll survive. So Atrahasis built the boat. It was large, sturdy, and probably smelled like cedar. In mild panic, he loaded it with food, animals, and enough supplies to survive a very wet apocalypse. Then the rains came. Not gentle drizzle, not poetic mist, but torrents, the kind that made rivers jealous. The heavens opened, the earth trembled, the cities vanished beneath waves. Even the goats looked surprised. For 7 days and nights, the flood raged. The gods watched. Enlil felt smug. Enki felt guilty. Ishtar wept. I didn't think it would be this bad, she whispered, watching the world drown. And then, silence. The waters receded. The boat landed. Atrahasis stepped out, blinking at the soggy world. He offered thanks. He built an altar. He probably hugged a sheep. The gods, seeing the aftermath, had second thoughts. Enlil muttered, maybe we overreacted. Enki nodded. Next time, let's try a strongly worded tablet. And so, the flood ended. Humanity began again. The gods agreed to be more patient, and Atrahasis became a legend. The man who survived the divine storm with wisdom, wood, and a very well-packed boat. In the city of Uruk, where the walls were tall and the ziggurats reached for the stars, like sleepy staircases, there lived a king named Gilgamesh. He was strong, very strong, so strong that he could wrestle lions before breakfast and still have time to complain about temple renovations. He was 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, which made math confusing, but storytelling exciting. Gilgamesh ruled with confidence. He built mighty walls, led heroic battles, and occasionally challenged the gods to arm wrestling matches. Metaphorically, of course. But he had a problem. He was restless. Not the kind of restless that makes you pace around your room at midnight wondering if you left the oven on. No, this was existential restlessness. Gilgamesh wanted more. More meaning. More adventure. More answers to questions like, why do we die? And is there a way not to? The gods watched, amused and slightly concerned. He's too proud, they whispered. He needs balance. Also, a friend. So they created Enkidu. Enkidu was wild. Literally, he lived among animals, ran with gazelles, and probably had twigs in his hair. He was strong, untamed, and free. But the gods sent a priestess to teach him about civilization, bread, wine, and polite conversation. Enkidu changed. He learned. He bathed. He stopped wrestling trees. And then he went to Uruk to meet Gilgamesh. Their first meeting? A fight. They wrestled in the streets, knocking over market stalls and alarming goats. But neither could win. They were equals. And in that moment of sweaty, dusty stalemate, they became friends. Best friends. Together, they embarked on adventures, slaying monsters, defying gods, and writing the kind of stories that would one day be carved into clay tablets and read by sleepy dreamers like you. But beneath the heroics, Gilgamesh still felt that tug, that quiet, nagging question. What happens when we die? And so, the tale of Gilgamesh truly began, not with battles or walls, but with a quest, a journey to find the secret of eternal life, a search for meaning in a world shaped by gods, clay, and the occasional divine flood. Before cities had walls and kings had crowns, there was Enkidu. He wasn't born in a palace. He wasn't carved from clay by a committee of gods. He was shaped by nature, wild, free, and covered in the kind of moss that makes squirrels jealous. Enkidu lived among animals. He ran with gazelles, drank from rivers, and probably had deep, philosophical conversations with owls. He didn't know cities. He didn't know laws. He didn't know that humans had invented shoes and awkward small talk. But the gods knew. They had created Enkidu as a balance, a counterweight to Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, who was growing too proud, too powerful, and too fond of dramatic speeches. Enkidu was meant to humble him, or at least wrestle him into a nap. So, the gods sent a priestess, wise, kind, and very persuasive. She found Enkidu by the watering hole and introduced him to civilization. Slowly, gently, she taught him about bread, wine, music, and the importance of not howling at the moon during temple hours. Enkidu changed. He bathed. He dressed. He learned words like barter and etiquette. He began to dream, not just of rivers and antelope, but of cities, people, and a strange king named Gilgamesh. Their meeting was legendary. Enkidu arrived in Uruk and challenged Gilgamesh. They fought. A dusty, sweaty, mythological wrestling match that knocked over market stalls and startled at least 3 goats. But neither could win. They were equals. And in that moment, something shifted. They became friends. Not just casual, let's grab barley beer friends. Deep, soul-bound companions. They laughed. They explored. They shared dreams and fears. They became the kind of duo that scribes would write about for centuries. The wild man and the king, the forest and the city, the heart and the crown. Together, they faced monsters. They defied gods. They carved their names into the clay of legend. But Enkidu never forgot the wild. He still listened to the wind. He still understood animals. He still carried the quiet wisdom of the forest, the kind that doesn't shout, but hums beneath the surface. And when fate turned, when the gods grew stern and the stories darkened, it was Enkidu's journey that reminded Gilgamesh of what it meant to be human, to love, to lose, to seek meaning in the silence. There are places in mythology that shimmer with light, temples, gardens, rivers that giggle, and then there are places that whisper in the dark. The underworld was one of those. In Mesopotamian myth, the underworld wasn't fiery or filled with pitchforks. It was quiet, dusty, a realm beneath the earth, where souls wandered like shadows, and the air tasted like forgotten dreams. And one day, Ishtar decided to visit. Why? Well, reasons vary. Some say she wanted to comfort her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Others say she was seeking power, or answers, or maybe just a dramatic vacation. Whatever the reason, she packed her divine pride and descended. But the underworld had rules. 7 gates guarded the way, and at each gate, Ishtar had to give something up. Her crown, her jewelry, her robes, her eyeliner. Probably, by the time she reached the final gate, she was bare, vulnerable, mortal. Ereshkigal was not pleased. She saw her radiant sister standing in the shadows and said, "You don't belong here." Ishtar protested. Ereshkigal frowned. And then, silence. Above, the world began to wither. Without Ishtar, love faded, crops wilted, music stopped. Even the goats looked melancholy. The gods panicked. "We need her back," they whispered. Also, the barley festival is next week. So, they sent help, a clever spirit, a whisper of life, a divine negotiator. Ereshkigal agreed to release Ishtar, but only if someone took her place. A soul for a soul. A shadow for a shadow. Ishtar returned. The world bloomed. The music resumed. But the memory of the underworld lingered. A quiet reminder that even goddesses must face the dark. And so, the journey to the underworld became a myth of descent and return, of loss and renewal, of the strange, sleepy balance between life and death. The underworld itself, it remained, a realm of dust and echoes, not cruel, not fiery, just quiet. If the gods were a family, dramatic, divine, and occasionally prone to flooding things, then Enki was the clever uncle who always had a plan, a pun, and a potion. He lived in Eridu, surrounded by rivers, reeds, and the gentle gurgle of wisdom. His home was the Abzu, the fresh water deep beneath the earth, where knowledge flowed like sleepy currents, and fish occasionally whispered secrets. Enki wasn't loud. He didn't roar like Enlil, or sparkle like Ishtar. He thought, he listened, he solved, and when humanity was in trouble, which, let's be honest, happened often, Enki was the one who quietly stepped in. When the gods grew tired of noisy humans and planned the great flood, Enki whispered to Atrahasis, guiding him to build a boat and save the world. He didn't defy the gods directly. He just bent the rules, like a river curving around a stubborn rock. When crops failed, Enki taught irrigation. When confusion reigned, he gave writing. When someone misplaced a sacred goat, he probably invented the first divine lost and found system. But Enki's wisdom wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. He understood balance between chaos and order, freedom and law, laughter and silence. He believed that humans weren't just clay puppets. They were curious, creative, and capable of growth. So, he gave them secrets, not all at once. That would be overwhelming. Instead, he whispered them slowly through dreams, symbols, and the occasional talking fish. He taught them how to heal, how to build, how to ask questions that didn't have easy answers. And when the gods argued, Enki mediated. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He told stories. He made jokes. He offered solutions that made everyone blink and say, "Oh, that might work." He was the god of fresh water, yes, but also of fresh ideas. And his wisdom flowed not just through rivers, but through time, through myths, poems, and sleepy bedtime stories, told under starry skies. In the myths of Mesopotamia, death wasn't a doorway to paradise or punishment. It was a descent, a slow, silent slide into the underworld where everything was muted, dusty, and dreamlike. They called it the land of no return, not because it was cruel, not because it was fiery, but because once you entered, you stayed. It was a place of shadows, not torment, but stillness, a realm beneath the earth, where souls drifted like forgotten whispers. The underworld had a queen, Ereshkigal. She ruled with quiet authority, seated on a throne of stone, surrounded by spirits who no longer remembered their names. She wasn't evil. She wasn't angry. She was simply there, the keeper of endings, the guardian of silence. Souls arrived through a gate, not golden, but heavy. They passed through 7 thresholds, shedding their earthly ties, clothes, titles, memories. By the time they reached the heart of the underworld, they were bare, just essence, just echo. There was no judgment, no reward, no punishment, just existence. The dead ate dust. They drank mud. They lived in a kind of eternal twilight where time didn't tick. It drifted. Occasionally, a god would visit. Occasionally, a soul would whisper a forgotten song. But mostly, it was quiet. And yet, the living remembered. They built tombs. They offered food. They whispered prayers to keep the dead comfortable, not to save them, but to honor them, to say, "You mattered. You still do." Even mighty heroes like Gilgamesh feared this fate, not because it was painful, but because it was lonely. He searched for immortality, not to escape torment, but to escape forgetting. The underworld wasn't cruel. It was inevitable. Time, even in myth, moves like a river, carving, shifting, forgetting. The gods of Mesopotamia were once mighty. They shaped the world, ruled the heavens, whispered secrets into clay. Their names were etched into tablets, sung in hymns, and offered incense in temples that shimmered like dreams. But dreams fade. As centuries passed, the cities changed. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, once sacred centers of divine presence, began to crumble. The ziggurats, those stairways to the stars, cracked beneath the weight of time and sand. Priests grew silent. Offerings stopped. The gods waited. It wasn't a war. It wasn't rebellion. It was forgetting. New empires rose. New gods arrived. The myths of Enlil, Ishtar, and Enki were tucked into libraries, then buried beneath newer stories. The divine council dissolved into dust. The tablet of destinies was lost, or perhaps simply unread. Even mighty Marduk, once the hero of Babylon, faded into the background. His temple, the grand Esagila, stood tall for a while, then fell, not with thunder, but with quiet neglect. The gods didn't die. Gods rarely do. They became echoes, whispers in the wind, symbols carved into forgotten bricks, names that flicker in dreams and dusty scrolls. They lingered in lullabies, in the curve of riverbanks, in the way the stars still blink like ancient eyes. And the temples? Some were swallowed by sand. Others were repurposed, turned into homes, markets, or places of other worship. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the hum of old prayers in the stones, a sleepy rhythm, a divine heartbeat. The fall of the gods wasn't tragic. It was natural, like autumn leaves drifting from sacred trees, like incense fading into twilight, like stories waiting to be retold. Before pyramids rose, before scrolls were written, before bedtime stories had names, there were the gods of Mesopotamia. They were the first to shape clay into meaning, the first to whisper order into chaos, the first to teach humans how to farm, write, sing, and wonder. Anu, the Sky Father, watched from above, silent, vast, and eternal. And Lil, the stormy administrator, brought law and thunder, reminding mortals that power must be respected. Enki, the clever water god, flowed through the world with wisdom, laughter, and loopholes. Ishtar, radiant and wild, danced between love and war, reminding us that passion is never simple. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, held space for endings, not cruel, just quiet. And Marduk, the young hero, rose from rebellion to reshape the world, proving that even gods evolve. Together, they formed the divine blueprint of civilization, not just temples and tablets, but the very rhythm of life. They gave us stories. They gave us seasons. They gave us the idea that the world could be understood, even if only in fragments. Their myths weren't just tales. They were maps, guiding humanity through floods, fears, friendships, and fate. And though their temples have crumbled and their names have faded from daily speech, they still linger in rivers, in stars, in the quiet moments when we ask, why are we here? And what comes next? The first gods of humanity may be forgotten by history's loudest voices, but they are remembered in whispers, in the hush of twilight, in the curve of ancient ruins, in the stories we tell when the world feels big and sleep feels near. So now, as our journey ends, let's thank them for the clay, for the chaos, for the questions, for the quiet. And as the stars blink above and the myths settle into dreams, let's close the tablet, dim the torch, and drift into the soft silence of story's end. Good night. May your dreams be filled with rivers, ziggurats, and gods who still whisper.